When I was 21, I took a summer job working as a caretaker at an old lodge deep in the Adirondacks. It wasn't a fancy gig. My job was to maintain the trails, check on the cabins scattered through the woods, and make sure the property was safe. The owners had inherited the place from a distant relative and had plans to renovate it into a boutique retreat. But for now, it was a crumbling relic. The lodge itself was a massive, creaky building with peeling paint, moss-covered shingles, and a wide porch that sagged in the middle. Surrounding it were over 200 acres of dense forest, dotted with 6 smaller cabins. These cabins hadn't been occupied in decades. I was told no one had stayed overnight at the lodge since the 1980s. It sounded perfect, quiet, peaceful. I figured I'd spend the summer working during the day and reading by the fire at night. I even brought a notebook, thinking I might write something, but of course, that's not what happened. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time clearing brush and patching holes in the cabins. The isolation didn't bother me. In fact, I enjoyed it. But then on the 4th night, I started hearing the noises. It began as faint tapping, irregular and distant. At first, I thought it might be animals, raccoons or squirrels. But it didn't sound like little feet scurrying. It was sharper, like knuckles rapping on wood. It seemed to come from the porch of the lodge. Every time I opened the door to check, nothing was there. Just the pale light of my flashlight cutting into the woods. By the 6th night, the tapping escalated. It came from all directions now. The walls of the lodge, the windows, even the roof. I'd circled the building with my flashlight, my breath fogging in the cool night air, but I never found anything. That's when I started noticing the lights. The lodge didn't have electricity. I used gas lamps and candles for light, but at night, deep in the forest, I would see faint, flickering lights. At first, I assumed they were fireflies, but these weren't yellow or green. They were pale blue, like the cold glow of a phone screen. Sometimes there'd be 1 or 2 lights, sometimes a dozen, bobbing between the trees. They never came close, but they never disappeared entirely either. It was like they were circling me, watching. I mentioned the lights to the property owners when they called to check in, but they brushed it off. Probably just campers, they said, or someone out hunting. But I knew that wasn't it. The lights didn't move like people. They floated, swaying unnaturally, too high for fireflies and too low for lanterns. I decided to stay inside after dark, keeping the doors locked and the curtains drawn. One morning, as I made my rounds, I found something strange at one of the cabins. Cabin 6, the farthest one from the lodge. The door was open, swinging lazily on its hinges. I knew I'd locked it the day before. Inside, everything was damp. The walls were streaked with moisture, and the old furniture looked like it had been dragged around. The smell was unbearable, a mix of mildew and something metallic. At first I thought an animal had gotten inside, but there were no claw marks or droppings, just a single wet footprint in the center of the floor. Barefoot. Human. I locked the cabin again and didn't report it. I didn't want to sound paranoid. That night, the noises grew louder. I didn't bother investigating anymore. I lay in my bed, fully dressed, gripping the flashlight and staring at the ceiling. Around 2 a.m., the tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. That's when I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching the gravel outside the lodge. Whoever or whatever it was didn't care about being quiet. I turned off my lamp and crept to the window, peeking through the gap in the curtains. "What is that?" I asked. The lights were closer now, weaving between the trees just beyond the clearing. But there was something else. A figure stood in the middle of the yard. It was too dark to make out any details, but it was tall and unmoving. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were looking at me. My flashlight was in my hand, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it on. I just stared, frozen, as the figure slowly raised an arm and pointed toward the woods, toward cabin 6. And then it was gone, just vanished. The next morning I packed my bag and drove into town. I found a bar and ordered a beer even though it was barely noon. When the bartender asked if I was staying at the lodge, I hesitated, but nodded. "Careful out there," he said, wiping down the counter. "That place has a history." I pressed him for details and he told me about a local legend. Decades ago, before the lodge was built, a small village stood in the forest. The settlers were poor and isolated, struggling through harsh winters. Rumor has it they turned to dark practices to survive: rituals, sacrifices. One year, the entire village disappeared without a trace. Later, when the lodge was built, workers reported strange sightings: lights in the woods, voices calling their names. A few even quit on the spot. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I just finished my drink and left. When I returned to the lodge, I couldn't shake the bartender's story. I decided to do something reckless. That night, I waited until the lights appeared and followed them. I told myself it was just curiosity, but deep down, I felt compelled, like I didn't have a choice. The lights led me through the woods, farther than I'd ever gone before. The trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at my jacket. I stumbled over roots and rocks, the flashlight flickering in my hand. The air grew colder, heavier. And then, finally, I saw it. A clearing. In the center of the clearing was a large circular pit. It looked ancient, the stones around it worn smooth. The lights hovered above the pit, spinning slowly. At first, I thought it was empty, but as I stepped closer, I saw movement. Something shifted in the darkness below, something wet and glistening. And then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language I recognized. It was inside my head, crawling behind my eyes. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand and shattering on the rocks. The lights flared, blinding me. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the ground outside cabin 6. It was dawn. My clothes were soaked, and my boots were caked in mud. I had no memory of how I got there. I quit the next day. I told the owners I was feeling sick and left without waiting for my final paycheck. They didn't seem surprised. I've never gone back to the Adirondacks, but sometimes, late at night, I dream about the clearing, about the pit. I wake up with the whispers echoing in my head, my chest tight, and my heart racing. A few months ago, out of morbid curiosity, I looked up the lodge online. It's abandoned now. The renovations never happened. According to the article, the new owners disappeared last summer. The last time anyone saw them, they were heading into the woods. The story ends there, but the question lingers. What did I see that night, and why do I still feel like something is watching me, even now, even here in the safety of my own home?